So, welcome to our Bible series, Particular Times, and actually we are going to have our second lecture. But before we start with our second lecture, I think it is very important to understand the bigger picture of these Bible series. And in our first lecture, we had the opportunity to go deeper and to find an answer on the very important question, where are we now in the timeline? And the answer that we give on that question should be, and that is extremely important, should be for 100% focused on the scripture, on the word that God gave us. And we should not base our certainty on what we see in the newspaper. We see every day all kind of events and things that might indeed be related with what we do read in Matthew 24. And most probably, many of these items do have a connection with Matthew 24. But nevertheless, the base of our faith is not what we see in the newspaper, but is for 100% based on what God told us. The prophecies are very clear, and the prophecies are sufficient, and it is through prophecy that we do understand and that we can fully be sure at where we are in that timeline. So we have seen that Protestantism is a promise, but is also a sign, and that sign shows us that what we have been foretold, that unity between all these different churches, that unity is something that we should see as a sign. And we were foretold that once we will see that unity, that the Protestant churches will hand over the hand to the Roman power. And unfortunately, we have seen that this occurred. It's a process, but it started in 1999 and it went on until 2017, which is exactly 500 years after that Martin Luther started the Reformation. This sign is very particular, and I would like to quote Jesus Christ himself. We can read in Matthew 24 on the verse 32 and 33. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all things, you know that it is near at the doors. So we were clearly foretold that these are the signs where we should have a particular attention to. And once this would happen, we would know that we would be very near at the start of the end time events. But being at the very start of the end time events has some consequences. That means that we should also understand that we are at a point where Satan will unleash all its power, because he also knows that his time is running short. And if he wants to have a victory, well, then it's time now to have that victory. So that means that we will be confronted to things we have never seen before. Satan is the opponent. He accused God, but he is outrageous and he hates the people of God. And that hate will lead him to a full attack to the people of God. But we should not be afraid, not at all, and that because of two very good reasons. First, because we do know very well what Satan is going to do and how he's going to do it. So even though he is inexperienced with sin, we do know his plans and his plan of action. And the second, why we should not be feared, is very simple. because the one who is with us is way stronger than the one who is against us. So the study of God's word and the study of the prophecies particularly is not something where we should be afraid of, but is something encouraging, and that shows us that God is taking the lead and that he knows what he is doing, and that we can be faithful, and that we can know that he will lead us to the point where he wants us to have. So I think we are ready now to go to our second lecture, which is an item that will explain us one of the things that Satan is going to do to attack God's people. And the title of our lecture is The Beast and the Kings of the Earth, which might seem at first glance a very strange title, but in fact it is a study of the book of Revelation, and more particularly on chapter 17. It is a difficult chapter. It is also a very sensitive chapter because we will speak about people, we will speak about specific organizations, and that is, well, that is sensitive, and it's not a funny thing to do. It might hurt, but the reason why we will do this study is not because we will feel better than these people or organization where we will talk about, or that they are wrong and that we feel good to show that they are wrong. No, it's to learn, because we should know that King Solomon said, "There is nothing new under the sun," and the errors that have been made, well, we could do the same errors. So that is the true reason why we should study particularly the prophecies and to study it in details. There is another text that I would like to share. It's a text that we can read in Ezekiel and chapter 13, and then the verses 10 and 11. But I have highlighted a few words, and the point is, the message that we read there is that it is a seduction of God's people if we would speak about peace when there is no peace. It is true that God is a God of love and mercy, that God is a God of all good things, but nevertheless, when there is a danger coming, when there is something that needs to be said, well, then we need to say it. Even though it might hurt, it might be painful. And God is very clear on that point. If we would speak about peace while there is no peace at all, well, at that moment, you are seducing his people. And that is not something that God asks us to do. On the other hand, a few other quotations, and I will only read the highlights of these quotations. In Testimonies for Ministries, for example, we do read that if we, churches, would realize the nearness of the events portrayed in the Revelation, a reformation would be wrought in our churches, and many more would believe the message. So if we are eager to see result of our many evangelistic campaigns, if we would see results of the testimonies that we share, if we would like to see that people would turn their ear and listen to God's messages, what can we do? It is good to teach and it's good to share testimonies. But in fact, there is a great need of a reformation in our churches. And that reformation will only come if we would realize the nearness of the events where the book of Revelation speaks about. Second quotation. We need to speak the plain truth. And when we speak the truth, it needs to be brought in a clear cut. So we should not try to avoid the most sensitive things and try to say something, but yeah, not really say it. Let's hope that they do understand while we say something. No, that is not the way God asks us to bring a message. If a message needs to be brought, we need to bring it clear cut. It needs to be very clear what you mean. It needs to be very clear what you say, so that people do not have to guess what the message is, but that they can hear what you are trying to say. But at the same time, while being clear cut, we always need to uplift Jesus. It's not to hurt people, but it is with the true desire to uplift Jesus, even if a message that might hurt people is to be brought. So now we know these things, of that we have this in our mind, we can start the study of chapter 17 of the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation is the book that is known as being a book full of prophecies. And God has given us a promise. We referred it already earlier. In Amos chapter 3, verse 7, we can read the promise that God gave to his people, that he said, I will do nothing, but I will reveal that secret unto the servants through the prophets. So that means that while studying the prophecies, we do know what God wants us to reveal us. And we have many examples. And like, for example, Jeremiah, he foretold how Babylon will fall. He even gave the name of Chorus, who would lead the attack that would go to the fall of Babylon. We have John the Baptist, who also foretold and was prophet, who foretold the work of Jesus. But let us not forget that the greatest prophet of all is Jesus himself. And even though he might not be known as a prophet, he is. We can take, for example, Luke 21, or the parallel chapter Matthew 24. It is a very well-known chapter as being a prophetic chapter. While Luke 21 is much more the story which is related to the historical fact, and that is the fall of Jerusalem as a literal city. Matthew 24, because in the answer that Jesus gave on the question of the disciples, when would the temple be destroyed, Jesus mingled two lines in between, because you have two ways to destroy the temple. You can destroy the building, and that is what happened at the historical moment when Jerusalem was taken. But you have another way to destroy the temple, and that is to destroy the temple through what the temple and the whole sanctuary tries to reveal us, because the whole sanctuary has been given us to as a teaching, as a revelation of who God is and how he's going to deal with sin. And if you would succeed in deceiving and changing that truth, so that people do not understand anymore how God is dealing with sin, then you also destroy the temple. And that is much more what Matthew 24 is dealing with. So Luke 21 is the historical fulfillment. Matthew 24 is the much wider fulfillment of that prophecy. And if we take a particular look at Matthew 24, and here again, I would like to pinpoint what is highlighted, we can read in that chapter that Jesus says that there will be a time that we will be hated of all nations. This is a very short part of the verse, so we can easily read through it and read over it. But when we stop at it and we start to think, what does that really mean? Well, That means that at this moment we have like 7 to 8 billion people all over the world, and that means that all of these 7 to 8 billion people, there will be one day that all of them will hate the children of God. Now, hate is a very strong word, because if nowadays I would share my faith with people where I live or where I work, a lot of people will see me as strange. Or if I say that I do believe in creation, they will see me like a simple mind. But they will not hate me. Hate is something different. Hate is very strong. So we could question, we can have some questions about what will happen, how is it possible that such a multitude of people, 7 to 8 billion people, will come to the point to hate us? This is a very important question to answer, and we will not answer it right away, but through this lecture I think it will be clear why all these people will hate the children of God. When we go to the chapter of Revelation and we would read the first 8 verses, and I really would invite you to do so, to take some time and to read those 8 verses, then we would see that we have 3 major key players in that chapter. At first, we have a woman, which is also portrayed as a harlot. We do have the kings of the earth, they are 10, and then we have the beast. And to understand the true meaning of the chapter 17, well, obviously it is important to understand who these key players are. Who is that woman, who is also portrayed as a harlot? Who are the 10 kings? And who is the beast? Well, let us start now with a woman. A woman is can of course be a human being like Eve was, but a woman is also used in Bible as a symbol, and we have many texts in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, where a woman is as a symbol for God's church, God's people. And I think that's very important to understand. Here we also see that God has made something very marvelous in our creation, because in our creation we also have marriage. And if we want to understand how Jesus relates to his church, well, we need to think of how a man relates to his wife. That's exactly the same. And so it is a common thing to see a woman portrayed as a symbol for God's people or God's church in Scripture. Unfortunately, the church can be faithful, but can also be unfaithful. And that is why we also do have quite some texts, again, as well in the New as in the Old Testament, we do have quite some texts where that woman is portrayed as a harlot. I would refer to Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 20 or Ezekiel chapter 16. I also would like to invite you to take some time to read those verses and even read the whole chapter. And it is clear that a harlot is always connected with an unfaithful church or an unfaithful people of God. And unfortunately, we have seen that the people of God, all through the ages, they did have many times where they were very unfaithful. And that is why we do read quite a lot about harlots in the scripture. So, if we go back now to the chapter of Revelation, and if we do know that the harlot is a symbol for an unfaithful church, now we should try to find out which church in particular. And in chapter 17, that harlot has three very specific characteristics. We can read. First of the characteristics given is that she is drunken with the blood of the saints. A second characteristic is that she is in purple and scarlet color. And a third characteristic is that she is covered with gold and precious stones and pearls. So let us now, based on these three items, find out which church, which unfaithful church might have these three characteristics. Drunken with the blood of the saints. If we would study history and if we would listen to what has been said about what happened in history, well, there is a church who acknowledged itself, the church itself acknowledges that they had a key role in the persecution of many thousands, hundred thousands of people who were put to death, have been burned at the stake only because they wanted, their desire was to keep the word of God instead of accepting all kind of traditions. And that church who acknowledges its role that it played during many, many centuries in the ages is the Roman Catholic Church. And here again, we do not point the finger to a specific church because we feel that we are better. No, we just try to understand what God has given us through chapter 17 of the book of Revelation. So we see that there is a woman, an unfaithful one, which is an unfaithful church, and we are trying to find out which church that might be. That was the first characteristic, drunken with the blood of the saints. The second characteristic is that it was covered by precious stones and pearls and gold and so on. And in 2017, and even before, the Roman Catholic Church was scattered because quite some scandals came above, and most of these scandals were related to pedophilia. But in 2017 particularly, there was a charge against the number 3 of the Vatican. And while there was that charge, and the Cardinal Pell, who was charged and accused for pedophilia, while there was that court, we tried to find out, people tried to find out how rich is the Roman Catholic Church in Australia? What's its wealth? And of course, it's very hard to determine that exactly. But they found out that it must be somewhere around 10 billion of US dollars, and that is just for the Australian Roman Catholic Church. The Australian Roman Catholic Church is worth like 10 billion US dollar. So if you would take the church worldwide, and then more specifically in the Roman Catholic countries, which Australia is not, one can imagine what a tremendous wealth that must be. That is the second characteristic. And then we have the third one, which are the colors, purple and scarlet red. Well, purple is the color of the bishops, and red is the color of the cardinals. Now, of course, purple and red, we can find these colors also in other churches, but a picture like this that can be only one church. There is only one church where these colors are so clearly in the picture, and that is the Roman Catholic Church. So we do understand now that one of the key players in chapter 17 is the Roman Catholic Church. But of course, we should also understand the other two key players. In chapter 17, verse 3, we have the beast. So we should also determine exactly who the beast is. We have some characteristics about that beast in chapter 17, and when we compare them with what we do read in Revelation 13, it is beyond any doubt that the beast, which is spoken of in Revelation 17, is exactly the same beast as the one who is coming out of the sea in Revelation 13. You have a lot of corresponding characteristics, and it is so obvious that it must be the same beast. It's important to know that. So first we have seen that the harlot is a symbol of an unfaithful church, but a beast is something else. It's not a church. And Daniel chapter 7 verse 23 is very clear. In that chapter we read also quite a lot about beasts. We have that lion, the bear, and so on. And there we can read in verse 23, a beast is a kingdom. So here we do not deal with a church, but we deal with a kingdom, which is very important to make that distinction. So based on Revelation 13, we do know, and unfortunately we do not have the time here to develop the whole chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, and I really do hope that this is known, and if not, that you can find somebody who can help you through the study of Revelation 13. But through the characteristics that are given in the prophecy in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, it is clear that here again we have to deal with the Roman Catholic Church, but slightly different, because it's not a woman, it's a beast. So here it is like the Vatican. So we do have the Vatican, which is a country, which is a nation, even though it might be small in square miles, but it is a nation, and it is even a powerful nation. And we do also see that there is a very close relation between that woman and the beast, so between the church and the state. But we will come back later on this. But we have already defined the harlot and the beast. Then it's up to the 10 kings, the 10 kings of the earth. That is a little harder to define exactly, because we don't have that many characteristics, so it is very dangerous to put specific names. Now, one of the theories is that the 10 kings, the number 10 is something that we do find in many places when it comes to prophecies. And I think one of the best known prophecies is the one we can find in Daniel chapter 2, and where you have that statue of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and that statue ends in 10 toes. And we do know that those 10 toes are the 10 barbarian tribes who have put an end on the Rome of the Caesars. Now the question is, the 10 kings where we read about in Revelation 17, can they be the 10 barbarian tribes that have put an end on Rome of the Caesars? Well, let us take verse 16 of chapter 17 of Revelation, and there we can read the 10 horns, which thou have seen upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Now, that verse is very, very hard to put in the past. That is not what happened. The 10 tribes have not broken the church, they have broken the Roman system of the Caesars, but not papal Rome. So that means that what we do read there is something that is going to occur in the future. So it is very hard to put the 10 kings of the earth of Revelation 17 on the same line as the 10 barbarian tribes of the end of Roman Empire. That means that the 10 kings, of course, the word king is quite obvious to understand. A king is somebody who rules. That is a political power who has also the power to rule and to put laws and to enforce laws. And the 10 kings of the earth, we might have the idea that they have the power of the whole earth, or at least the most important parts of the earth. And we also understand that is something in the future, that there is a close relation with the Roman Catholic Church, because if we would read like verse 12, we do see that the 10 horns which we saw are 10 kings, and they received, when they had no kingdom, they received power, and once they have that power as king, they will have that power for 1 hour with the beast. So once they will reign, and once they will have the power, they will reign or make sure that that power will also enforce the beast. Okay, we have seen in the last verse that after some time that relation will break down, but before it breaks down, they will work together for a short time. So we do have somewhere that political power that covers the earth, that will have strong power, and they will have that power or use that power to sustain the beast. That beast is the papal system, which is closely related with the church and state. That is what we have studied for now. Let us go back now on, or more specific, on verse 17. And there we see what is going to happen at that moment when those 10 kings do have the power. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, which is a very good news. But before we go to the good news, let us understand the 10 kings, together with the beast, they will make war with the Lamb. Now, I think it's very obvious to understand who the Lamb is. That is, of course, Jesus Christ. The 10 kings, even though we do not exactly determine who they might be, one thing is for sure, they are on earth. And the beast is on earth as well. Now, the problem is that Jesus is in the heavenly sanctuary. So there is kind of a problem here, because if you want, as being on earth, if you want to fight a fight with somebody who is in the heavenly sanctuary, that is going to be very hard to do that. So the question is, how is the beast and how are the 10 kings going to fight that war against the Lamb? Because they can't reach the heavenly sanctuary. While we are on earth, we do not have access to the heavenly sanctuary. We don't, the beast doesn't, and the 10 kings neither. So how are they going to make war with the Lamb? Well, I would like to invite you to take your Bible to a very well-known passage, which is Acts chapter 9 and there verse 5. There we can read, "And he said, 'Who art thou, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest.'" So who is talking here? Saul, which will become Paul, has been hit by a light, and he's down on earth. And he's amazed because he doesn't understand what happened, but he has heard a voice. And he asked, "Who art thou, Lord?" Because he understands that what's just happened to him was not just a coincidence, but it's God himself who did what just happened. And Saul asked, "Who art thou, Lord?" Because he doesn't understand. He was absolutely convinced that he was doing God's work. But now he lays down on the earth. And so he asked the question, "Who art thou, Lord?" And Jesus answered, "I am Jesus, who thou persecutest." Now, was Saul in effect persecuting Jesus? Well, when you take it to very specific, the answer is no. Saul was persecuting the disciples. He was persecuting the people of God. He was not really aware that he was in fact persecuting Jesus. But for Jesus, there is no difference. If you're persecuting the one he loves, well, then you persecute him. For Jesus, that doesn't make any difference. And Satan does know that. So he knows that if he wants to attack and if he wants to hurt Jesus, well, he can't do that immediately, but Jesus is out of reach. Well, he can do it by having an attack, a full attack to God's people. And that is exactly what he is going to do. Let us read now in chapter 14, verse 9. We can read there that in that fight, and it's about worship, if any man worship the beast and his image, because Bible calls us to worship God, and Satan tries to make sure that we do worship the beast and the image. So it's all about worship. Who do we worship? And in that fight, there is a mark where we can read, "And receive his mark." So all those who worship the beast and his image, they will receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand. The consequences are big of having that mark, because the consequences is that the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. But let us now focus more on that mark. That means that just before Jesus is coming back, we will have only two groups anymore. Now we do have the people who are faithful, the ones who are really opposed, and then you have a huge number of people who are totally unaware of what is going on really, that haven't heard anything about that great controversy between Jesus and Satan. But that big group is not going to last. They will also have to make a choice. And in the end, you will have only two groups. Or you have the mark of the beast, or you have the seal of God. There is no in between. And it would help here, of course, to know very well chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, but as told, it would take us too far to explain that in details. But prophecies are very clear on this, that the mark of the beast is the observance of a Sunday law. And the observance of the Sunday law can be done in two ways. Or you're totally convinced of it, and then you have the mark on your forehead, or you can adapt because of all kind of pressure. It will be very hard not to keep the Sunday. And so if you don't want to lose your work, your job, or you don't want to lose your status or whatever, well, you just conform to the laws that had been voted, and you just keep the Sunday law, not because you're that religious, but just because it's easier to do. Well, at that moment, you do have the mark on your hand. While the seal of God, which is the observance of the true Sabbath, the seal of God is, you can only have it in one way, and that is on your head, because you have to choose for it. You have to know what it is, and you choose for it. It will not be easy, so nobody will keep the Sabbath just because it's easier to do. That possibility will not exist. But we're going to see that later on. What is important to understand is that there will be a fight, or one of the fights that Satan is going to unleash over the people of God is that fight between the mark, which is Sunday law, and the seal, which is the true Sabbath. I would like to have some quotations, or take some time for some quotations who do show us how important it is to understand this. And in Testimonies for the Church, for example, we do read that God has committed to us a sacred and eternal truth. In the second quotation, and I do only take the highlighted items, his representatives, he has called them to be ambassadors for him in the last work of salvation. So we should understand that the choice that needs to be made, whether we choose God or we choose creation tradition, that choice, who do we worship, is a final choice. We are totally free to make that choice, but we are absolutely not free on what the consequences are of that choice. And as it is a final choice, it is a very important moment, because we do not want a single person to make that choice not knowing what is really at stake. And in the last quotation, we see they, which is us, the people of God, have been given a work of the most solemn importance, the proclamation of the first, the second, and the third angel's message. There is no other work of so great importance. And I think that once we do understand the consequences of bringing that message, or the consequences of not bringing that message, then we do understand indeed that God has entrusted us with the most important message, and that the time we are living at are not just particular, but are very important. And Satan does know that, and he is trying to prevent in all ways to make sure that we do not bring that so important message. I would like to go further with another few quotations. As America, the land of the religious liberty, as America will unite with papacy, which is still something to come. We have seen that the Protestant churches have already given the hand to Roman power, but we are not yet to the point that America as a nation has united with papacy, but it will be as such. Once this will happen, it will force the conscience and compelling man to honor the false Sabbath. The people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example. And next quotation, we see that, or we can read, the substitution of the laws of man for the law of God, the exaltation by merely human authority of a Sunday in place of the Bible Sabbath, is the last act in this drama here on earth. So it is very clear that that mark opposed to the seal of God, that this is a turning point in human history. That is like a major milestone within our timeline. It's important to remember that. And a few more quotations so that we do understand clearly what we are talking about. The so-called Christian world is to be the theater of great and decisive actions. Men in authority will enact laws controlling the conscience after the example of the papacy. Babylon will make all nations drink of the wine of wrath of her fornication. Every nation will be involved. Of this time, John the Revelator declares, these have one mind. This is what we can read in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. There will be a universal bond of union on one great harmony, a confederacy of Satan's forces, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast, and thus is manifested the same arbitrary, oppressive power against religious liberty. These words are so clear that it doesn't need any explanation. We might doubt that this would happen, but it is important to know these quotations, these prophecies, because the day that we see that they are becoming truth, even though we are now, or we might be now convinced that we will never have such a situation, well, the day it happens, then we have to think, how could these words been written? How could somebody know this unless it has been revealed by God? So we have been warned, and this is a message that we should bring. And even if we would doubt it, we can learn about it, and especially at the moment when we see that it's coming out. In the great controversy, we do have some more explanation how all these things will come through, because it's a major change in how society will be. At this moment, we see state, we see church, we see a lot of troubles. We see there is not that much unity. Many countries, when it starts to be very hard, when there is the economic difficult period, well, each country starts to work by its own and defends itself against the others. So there is no really a clear unity that we can perceive at this moment. But nevertheless, things have been foretold and also explained how they are going to happen. In the great controversy, we do read that there will be a very specific work done by the order of the Jesuits. That order has been created, and the goal of that order is very simple. It is to break the Protestant churches and to bring them back under the mother church, which is the Roman Catholic Church, and to make sure that the whole world is back under the authority of one leader, and that one leader is the Pope. That is the purpose, the reason for existence of the Jesuit order. And we have also been told how the Jesuit order does work. On the one hand, we do see that they do a very great work. They are visiting prisons, hospitals, and so on. They do very great work that all of us should do. But we are also warned that behind this garb of sanctity, there is a criminal and deadly purpose. It is an order where the fundamental principle is that the end justifies the means. That means that if you need to lie or to kill or whatever you need to do, everything is not just pardonable, but is also something that is recommendable to do as long as it serves the goal that you need to attain. That is the true spirit within the order of the Jesuits. And how do they work? We have seen that they have a particular attention to everything which is related to education, but not just education. Under various disguises, the Jesuits, and I'm reading the last paragraph, worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings. And I think besides the word of king, you could put president or parliament or government, whatever you call it. But they are climbing up to be the counselors, and they are shaping the policy of nations. So they are not the people we do know, but they are behind the scenes, and they make sure that once the people we do know, the kings and the presidents and so on, they need to take decisions, well, they are the ones who are giving advice, that they are shaping the policies of all these nations. Another thing is to know and to understand the history of that Jesuit order, because we can learn a few things about that as well. The Society of the Jesuits has been founded in 1534. It took some years before it was recognized in 1540. But after some time, in 1773 to be specific, the Society of the Jesuit order was in fact suppressed by the Pope. And it was a forbidden order for quite some time until 1814. So we do know the deadly wound in Revelation 13, which is in fact the deadly wound to papacy. Well, the Jesuit order had something similar. They also had a deadly wound, but they recovered. But it's also important to understand what did they do during that period that the order was forbidden. Well, during that period, because you can dismantle an order, but that doesn't mean that the people, that the leadership is just going to sit down and do nothing. On the contrary, they were very active. And what did they do? It is beyond any doubt that leadership of the Jesuit order, they started a new order, the Illuminati. And I do know that we have a lot of theories, and some are very, yeah, you could like make a Hollywood film of it. But it's not because the Illuminati has been linked with all kind of very strange theories that they do not exist. They do exist, even if their importance has been exaggerated, or even if the way of working has been exaggerated. That doesn't change to the fact that they exist, and they do still exist. And it's not just the Illuminati. When we study what the Jesuit order did, is they somehow entered into Freemasonry, and they reshaped it a little bit, and they made it attractive to Protestants. So today we see there is a very close relation between Protestants and Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is very good in trying to trigger people with all kind of symbols and mysterious things and so on. So people are curious, so they want to know more, and the symbols that are used in Freemasonry, many of them are somehow related to scriptures. But what's important to understand is that it's the Jesuits who made that Freemasonry is so attractive to Protestant believers. And the messages that are delivered through Masonry are in fact Jesuit messages. And it's not just the Freemasonry. We do have more orders. The Knights of the Order of Malta, for example, which is an order where the members of this order are people like, from example, the United Nations or the World Bank or very worldwide organizations. It's a very powerful organization. And maybe let us take some time why I do reflect to all these orders and all these secret societies. It's not just because they were mentioned in great controversy, because we do believe that every quotation of Ellen White has also a solid reference to the Bible. And I would like to invite you to take your Bible with me on the book of Revelation, and let us take there the chapter 18. And if we would go to verse 9 to start with, there we see again the kings of the earth. We have already talked about them. So we have the kings, but it's not just the kings. If we go a little further on the verse 11, there we see the merchants of the earth. Because it's not just the kings, but we also have the merchants of the earth. And then if we go a little further on verse 17, there we have shipmasters. And we also have all who travels by ship. And we also have sailors. That makes quite a lot of people over there in chapter 18. It's not just kings, but we have merchants, we have shipmasters, we have ship travelers, we have sailors, a lot of people. And who are all these peoples? Well, somewhere they are all connected with water, with sea, with a lot of water. And when we go back on chapter 17, and there we would take verse 15, we can read, "The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are the peoples, the multitude, the nations, and the tongues." That means that the people where chapter 18 is referring to, these are people who have kind of an influence on the nations, on the peoples. And that is exactly what we are talking about. We see that people who have who are in a high level in the diplomatic world, well, many of them do know each other because they are also member within the Order of Malta. It's not just the Order of Malta. We have also the CIA. I think it's good to know in the Catholic Herald there was an article about the CIA and explains why excuse me, why the CIA is so closely related with the Catholic Church. Well, it's very simple, because many of the members of the CIA and many of the directors of the CIA were devoted Catholics, and not just devoted Catholics, but also member of the Order of Malta. So we have Freemason, we have Illuminati, we have the Jesuit Order, we have the Club of Bilderberg. That's another group of people. People who are member of the Club of Bilderberg are usually CEOs of large worldwide companies. They are wealthy families. So rich people who have a huge influence because of their wealth, bankers and so on. Not just Bilderberg Club, but you have also, it's not so well known, but you have, excuse me, I've just forgot the name, Skulls and Bones, excuse me. It's a secret society that suddenly was very well known just because the former president George Bush Jr. at some moment he said, "During my last year of college in Yale, I became a member of Skull and Bones, a secret society. It is actually this secretive that I cannot say more, just that I made 14 friends." So it's a network, and it was clear that those 14 friends were still closely related to the former president. So we see step by step that in fact there are quite some secret societies, and they are covering the whole world. And there are a lot of people in there who have huge influence. And what's also important to understand is that each of these secret societies, they do have somewhere a relation with the Jesuit order, and the Jesuit order is under the control of the Pope. So that is the structure behind things that we do not always see. And the next thing that I would like to point out is that at this moment we do have something that has never been seen before, and is that our actual Pope, Pope Francis, is the very, very first Pope who is at the same time member of the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order exists now for more than 500 years, and it has never happened that somebody who is member of the Jesuit order is at the same time Pope, except for now. It's the very first time. So that link between papacy and Jesuit order is at this moment extremely close. It cannot be closer. Okay, another quotation I would like to point at, which can be found in Testimonies for the Church: "A power from beneath is working to bring about the last great scenes in the drama. Satan coming as Christ and working with all deceivableness and unrighteousness in those who are binding themselves together in secret societies." So I do hope that we do not underestimate the work of secret societies. But at the same time, I would also like to take now a moment to, we need to be careful as well. It is very clear that secret societies do play a serious a role that we cannot deny, and that they are up to influence the policy that will be taken by the nations. But it's not because we do know this that at this moment we need to be against everything that comes from the government. I think we should not forget that Paul asked us to pray for the government. We are aware of what is going on, and we are aware of what will for sure happen. But we should not be afraid of it, and we should not fight against it. And we should also understand that at this moment, if the only one who is in control is God, and at this moment we also know that we still have the four winds who are retaining everything, because the reason is God's people are not ready. And as long as God is retaining the four winds, it's not up to us to make sure that the people around us start to look at the government with a fearful eye. That's not our work to do. So we should not spread the message that the government is doing bad things. We should not spread all kind of ideas that we call deep state. That's not the message that we need to bring. We need to understand what will happen, but we do have a completely different message to bring. So if we do study all these prophecies, is not to bring these as our message, but to understand what is going on. And once we see these things fulfilling, that we do understand what is going on and that we are not taken by surprise. So, again, we cannot deny the importance of the work of the secret societies, but we still need to pray for government. And we should also be aware that God is remaining the four winds, and that means that God is making sure that even if the government, they are still good people doing a good work over there. Okay, let us now go on with the study of our prophecies. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 13, in verse 14, and I would like to invite you to read it very, very carefully. And there is a question that needs to be answered. Who is doing what? Now, let us first read that verse. I added it because we just jump into the middle of the chapter. So, the beast of the earth, that is where it's all about. The beast of the earth, they deceived them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast of the sea. The beast of the sea has been explained in the first part of chapter 13. Saying, so the beast of the earth says to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. Now the question is, who is going to make an image to the beast? And let us be clear now, that image, we have seen that before in chapter 17, that the image of the beast is that image of that woman who sits on the beast, which in fact shows us the close relation between church and state. At this moment, most of the Western countries, they do have in their law, even in their constitution, that there is a strict division between church and state. Of course, in most of these countries, there are quite some relations, but there is still a difference. There is no total unity like we saw in the Middle Ages. Well, we do know by the prophecies that that unity, like in the Middle Ages, will be restored. The question is now, who is going to ensure that church and state will be back one unity? That's the question. And when we read carefully what is written here, then we see that the one who is making that image, it's the people who dwell on the earth. We might think it's the beast, but in fact, the role of the beast is to deceive them, is to have some influence, but it's on the demand, or it will be the people who dwell on the earth that will ensure that there is an image of the beast. Of course, they are not neutral again, and the role of the beast of the earth is very big. We can't deny that, but it's also to understand that the multitudes, those who dwell on earth, they do have a role as well, and even a very big role to play. And I would like to have a quotation here that we can find again in Great Controversy. And there we do read, "Political corruption is destroying love of justice and regard of truth. And even in free America, rulers and legislators, in order to secure public favor, will yield to the popular demand for a law enforcing Sunday observance. That is a very strange thing to read. That means that that Sunday law will not come top down, but will come because of the people will ask for it. And that will be so powerful that the corrupt leaders will indeed yield to that popular demand and will enforce such a Sunday law. We go further and we do read that how this will happen. Excuse me, I need to explain something. The question is that public favor. How or what do we perceive at this moment as being a request that is shared all over the world? Because that is what we are talking about. What is now living in all nations? What is now something that human beings, and I'm not speaking about leaders and so on, but what is a challenge or what is something that frightens all nations all over the world? Because that is what we are looking for. If you want to unite all nations, and if you want that all nations, the people all that dwell all over the earth, if you want them to ask one particular thing, there must be some very strong thing behind that request. And so we can ask ourselves, what could be behind that huge request, that strong request that comes from the nations? And once there will be that demand, leadership will offer an answer, and that answer will be what we have been foretold in the prophecies. But let us now go on the question, what is now the challenge that people all over the world face altogether? And for that, I would like to go back to the year 1992. And we had in 1992 something that was also very particular. It was the very first time in history that there was an agreement signed by almost all countries all over the world. And that agreement, and I do read what we can find on the internet, the climate agreement is a so-called framework. It's an agreement that was sealed in 1992 under the responsibilities of the United Nations, and it was signed during the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And the purpose of the agreement is to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gas so that the unwanted consequences of the climate change can be prevented. Climate change is something we do talk quite a lot about. Of course, like at this moment, we do have that pandemic, so climate change is now a little bit behind the scenes, but still, climate change is something that we can hear about all over the world. There is no part in the world where climate change is not part of news. And what do we read next when we look about climate change? We see that this climate agreement that took effect in 1994 is almost every country of the United Nations has signed that agreement ever since. It is the very first item that could combine all countries all over the world. And that's very important to understand, because the United Nations, they do exist already for quite some time, since 1948, but there was every agreement was agreed by majority. But this time we do have a topic that brings all nations all together. And the climax of this has been seen in Paris in 2015. And the French were, of course, very, very proud of this because they could say that in 2015 they had, for the very first time ever in history, an agreement that has been signed by all countries. Well, in fact, all countries except two, which is Syria and Vatican. Now, the reason why Syria didn't sign it is very simple. It's because in 2015 they were at war. And the Vatican City, which is also a nation, they didn't sign it because the Vatican has as a policy that they are always as an observer and not as a member. So that is why they didn't sign it. But besides these two countries, everybody signed that agreement of Paris, and that was the very, very first time. As I said, the French were very proud to have all kinds of articles, and they really stressed the fact that they were the very first to have such an agreement all over the world. And in 2017, even Syria also accepted and assigned the document on the agreements of Paris. But the agreement of Paris, they do have one very big problem, is that if you would like to implement what has been agreed in Paris in 2015, that would cost a fortune. It's very expensive to make sure that all these greenhouse gases and also toxic gases, they are reduced, because it has a direct impact on the economy. And so it's very hard for a politician to, especially in a democratic country, to go for an election and try to be elected while having the message, I will raise taxes because we need it to implement the agreements of Paris. I don't think that there is even one politician who is thinking about such a policy. So to implement the agreement, that's a huge challenge. But the MIT, of people related to MIT, they came with a study and they found out that, in fact, it is quite simple to have the agreements of Paris in practical. It's very easy in a way that it would not even cost a lot of money, because if everybody all over the world would maintain simultaneously 1 day of rest, that would reduce worldwide the emission of carbon for 15%, and that would result that the agreements of Paris would be fulfilled right away. So the only thing you need to do is to observe 1 day of rest simultaneously worldwide. Now that idea sounded like music in someone's ears. And that's the Pope. Because very short after the people from MIT published their conclusion, the Pope, he wrote what we call an encyclic, which is in fact a letter that is sent to all the bishops. And that letter is not just a letter, it became in fact a book. And that book might be quite known, Laudato Si, but the second title is very important, because the second title of that encyclic is On Care for Our Common Home. We do not have the time to go in detail into that letter of the Pope, but the point is that the Pope is very clear. He says that we do have such a day. We do have a particular day, and it's the day of the sacraments, and it's a day that is related to the Eucharisty, and it's a day where you do also have the time to share time with your family. So the Pope is very clear in his message. He stresses the importance of the Sunday, and of course also the positive signs of that Sunday for family and other things. But he is also very clear. It is the day where you go to church for the Eucharisty. It is the day of the sacrament. And for the Pope, it is very clear that the only way to give an answer to the challenges of climate change is the observance of the Sunday. And he is working very hard with that message, because we see that from then on, the Pope is really trying to use every opportunity that he has to stress that message and to share that message and to make sure that people are willing to accept that message. And he is doing that with quite some success. Like, for example, in 2015, and we are talking now about the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, he described the Pope as being the most strongest voice on earth of those who have no voice. And he says, because all the mayors and governors of the most important cities and parts of the world have been invited to the Vatican, and when they were there, the mayor of New York said that the reason why they are gathered together in the Vatican is not for a status quo, but is for to implement what has been discussed. In The Guardian, we see that there are new alliances coming up. And there is a new alliance uniting the largest cities all over the world. And those cities do have or represent many millions of people all over the world. And they are allied with only one purpose, and that is against climate change. So we slowly do see that indeed what we've read in chapter 13, that it is the multitudes, it's the people who are feeling that there is a challenge, and they are asking an answer towards a challenge. And then, as there is a challenge, there is a demand, people are looking for an answer. Well, then suddenly somebody comes with a policy, and that policy is explained. And after some time, we see that the policy is accepted as being the answer to the challenge. We read in manuscript releases, Satan puts his interpretation upon events, and they think, as the world have them, that the calamities which fill the land are a result of Sunday breaking. Thinking to appease the wrath of God, these influential men make laws enforcing Sunday observance. Why do I read this quotation? Well, the point is that we should not forget that all these things are just by coincidence. It is Satan who is working behind the scenes. And Satan is working through many channels. He is mainly working through emotions. And one of the most important and most powerful emotions is fear. Now, let us imagine that the natural disasters that we do know for the moment, like fire, we have seen in Australia, but also in California and other parts of the world, also in the Amazon and everywhere, all over the world, that there are huge fires which are very hard to stop. We have also seen that there is that much rain anymore. So drought is also a calamity. But on the other hand, we also see floods. So suddenly there is a lot of rain or a tsunami or whatever. So all over the world, you see things going on and a lot of people die. But let us imagine now that those calamities in the future will result in much more death than at this moment. That we are not speaking of hundreds of deaths, but of many, many thousands, 100,000s of people dying, of which many children. And that the idea that if we would observe the Sunday, that would result in the fact that those natural disasters wouldn't happen anymore. At that moment, if a mother has lost her children because of a flood or whatever, and you are a Sabbath keeper, I do think that the feelings of that mother who just lost her children will be like hate. They will hate us because they will think that we are the cause of everything. That if we would observe the Sunday, that carbon emission would decrease and that nature would become like before and that all those calamities wouldn't happen anymore. The reasoning is very simple, and that is exactly what Satan is trying to do. And once emotion do take control, well, then we are very close to hate. And now we start to understand what Jesus has foretold. He said that one day we will be hated by every nation. Now, as we do speak about the agreements of Paris, one might say, well, since 2015, something has changed. And that's true. There is a country who signed the agreement and who said, okay, but now we don't work anymore according to that agreement. And that is the United States, and the President Donald Trump took a very important decision in 2017 by announcing that he renounces to the Treaty of Paris. So one could say, oh, you see, that's proof that that idea that has been developed is not true. Well, let us be very careful, because the moment the President Donald Trump has announced that the treaty was not for the United States anymore, at that moment, another person stood right, and that is Michael Bloomberg. And he is a billionaire, he is a former mayor of New York, but he is also a spokesman of the United Nations, and he is representing the organization of the largest cities in the world. And he was very clear. He said, the US can still fulfill its pledges. That is what he said. And very soon after what Michael Bloomberg said, we see that quite some organizations stood up. There is, for example, the organization called We Are Still In, and they are representing many states. They are representing many, many people, and they do represent also a serious economic power. And it's not just We Are Still In. It's like, for example, also the Climate Alliance. As we see, it's a union of 14 states within the United States, and they do also have quite some economic power. So it's not because the president has said the treaty is not to be applied anymore than in the United States, that the United States are really out. On the contrary, we see again that what is foretold in Revelation 13 is really happening, because in Revelation 13 we have seen that the Sunday law will come on the demand of the people. It's the people dwelling on earth that are asking for the restoration of the image of the beast. And it is by that demand that the image of the beast will be made. I would like also to point to, for example, which is a very strange thing to read. We do see here the person who is speaking very close to the microphone. We do see the governor of California, which is in fact Jerry Brown, which is in fact a Democrat. And let us read what he says. He says, as a Democrat, the power here is faith. Now, if a Republican would speak about faith, is something normal. That's something we can expect of. But it's a Democrat. Yeah? He says the power here is faith. And then I go to the second paragraph. Society can't just rely on science and technology to combat climate change. And Brown said in his talk, it must begin to accept a need for a more transformational approach. Thus, he's stating that brainwashing was needed to advance action on climate change. It is very strange to hear that somebody who is a governor, that he says that we need a brainwashing to go forward in climate change or to meet the challenges of climate change. And then, again, last paragraph, Brown shared some of his experience in a Jesuit seminary. You can look that up for yourself, but I just want to show that indeed we should not underestimate what has been foretold, that the Jesuit order is working through education and is making sure that at the moment that the one who is in charge needs to have a policy, that the policy is already ready and written. And it is written with a lot of influence of those secret societies. I would like to invite you to read on of what Governor Brown says, but it is clear that as a Democrat, he is absolutely in support of what the Pope is sharing in Laudato Si. The question now is, can't we see what is really going on? Is that just coincidence? Well, the Wall Street Journal, which is absolutely not related to Bible, they wrote an article, Certainty, Climate Change, Church and State, and then the second title is America was formed on a basic premise of the separation of church and state, but the climate religion blends the two together. So it is very clear that even the Wall Street Journal sees that distinction between church and state, which is in fact one of the premises of the United States, that thing which is like a pillar, that it is now starting to be something that is questioned, that the separation between church and state is not that sure anymore. And we can go further with another example. The Attorney General, she said, Loretta Lynch, she said very clearly when she had to come for the Senate, she said that they were ready to take legal action against climate change deniers. So they did not go that far to start a legal case against people who denied climate change, but they were ready to do that. And let us be very clear at this moment. I do not want to argue if there is really a climate change or not. I think it's obvious there is a climate change. The whole question is, what is the reason of that climate change? And even more important is, how can we meet the challenge? And that is the answer on that last question, how do you meet the challenge of climate change? That is the most important question and the most important answer to be given. We have seen that the challenge of climate change will be used. The fear that is caused by climate change will be used to come to a Sunday law. But that does not mean that there is no climate change. I am convinced there is a climate change, but the only way to meet the challenges of that climate change is to go to the one who created everything. Don't we have a very simple example of people in a boat who were also very scared because of the weather, and they think they would sink and drown? And what did they do? Well, they went to Jesus and they prayed. This might seem a very simple answer, but that is an answer in faith. And we don't need a Sunday law to meet the challenges of climate change. That is all what it is about. It's not about denying climate change, it's about how do we deal with those challenges. In Great Controversy, we do see a parallel, and the parallel is drawn with Elijah the prophet. When Elijah entered the court of the king Ahab, what did the king say? King Ahab said, "Look at the one who caused all the troubles of Israel." Which troubles was it? Well, they did have already quite some troubles with climate change as well, because for more than 3 years there was no rain. And for a country which economy is based on agriculture, that is a disaster. But who was perceived as being the cause of all problems? It was presented as Elijah being the problem, while we do know that the real problem was not Elijah, it was not Ahab, it was the people. And that is what we need to understand, that we need to be prepared. That is what is really going on, and God is preparing its people as that we might be ready to proclaim the most important message that has ever been entrusted to people. I would like, and that is the very last parallel I would like to draw, is to look at Daniel. We see twice that faithful people do come in problems. The first time we see it in Daniel chapter 3, where the three friends of Daniel are in big trouble. And finally, they are thrown in the burning oven. Why are they in the burning oven? Well, there was a decree of King Nebuchadnezzar who said that everybody had to bow for the statue he just made. Was that the law specific aimed at God's people? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But the law, which was voted by the king, created such a situation that the faithful people needed to make a choice. And fortunately, the friends of Daniel, they were ready. They didn't bow. And what they didn't do either is that they didn't have to close their shoes. And that is an attitude many children of God do have. They would not bow, but at the sound of the trumpet, they would close their shoes. But in reality, that means that you do bow. The only thing that you need to do at the sound of the trumpet is to stand right, to stay like the friends of Daniel. Even though the law is not against you, even though you might perceive it as a law that, yeah, is it might be perceived as a very good law. And to be clear that everybody understands what I'm trying to explain is, if there would be a law that is voted with the idea to prevent further catastrophes and through climate change, as Christian, we can't be opposed to it. But even for such laws, if these laws would make us to bow for something or somebody else than God, well, then we need to have the attitude of the friends of Daniel. The law is not against us, but even if the law is not against us, we cannot act according to that law. The second example is Daniel 6, and that is later. So it starts with the law, which is not really meant to cause us troubles, but we will be in trouble. And the question is, will we be ready to have the same attitude as the friends of Daniel? And sometime later, there will be a law that is specifically made to harm us. And that is what we see in Daniel 6. But either way, we need to trust in God for 100%. And we will close with the last text of the scriptures, and that is what we do read in Revelation 17, the chapter we have been studying. And there we read in verse 14, "These shall make war," so the 10 kings and the beast, "they will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful." That is our future. Not the problems, not the persecution, but being called and being chosen and being faithful. That is our future. And that is then also my prayer, that we all might surrender our heart to be part of those who are called, chosen, and faithful. Amen.